Hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. We're now going to look at religion as one of the other concerns of Shakespeare's contemporaries and Shakespeare himself. And one of the concerns that really animates this play alongside its concern with politics. Indeed, in the period that we're talking about, the two are very much intertwined. And I want you to think about that relationship, about the politics of religion and the ways in which religion shapes politics. Part of this is, of course, because of the Reformation. Essex's rising is related to that Reformation, the change in England from essentially a Catholic religion aligned with Rome and under papal authority to essentially a Protestant religion, which is an English separatist church ruled over by the Queen as the head and governor of the Church of England and separated therefore from papal authority. So Essex's rising is part of that Reformation, the reforming of religious and therefore political life. And it's a measure of how complicated the Reformation is. I don't want you to worry too much about its specifics at the moment, but it's a measure of how complicated it was for people in its own time, that Essex was associated both with Catholicism and with extreme forms of Protestantism, which are often known as Puritanism. He'd inherited this role of Protestant champion from his uncle, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, but he was also accused of having Catholic sympathies, of plotting to become king himself and take England in a new religious direction. He was accused also of wanting James I, as he would later be, James VI of Scotland at the time, to ascend to the throne in the place of Queen Elizabeth, and there were concerns about James's religion too. His mother had been Catholic and had been executed for plotting against Queen Elizabeth, and James himself was in a very difficult position at home religiously and was continually under attack by extreme Protestant churchmen. It's all massively complicated, but what you do need to think about, I think, is the ways in which religion and politics is interconnected. Don't worry too much about the specifics, but remember that this is an intensely religious period and an intensely political period where the two are violently connected, and that shows itself very clearly in Hamlet. So what's going on here? Why is the Reformation so intensely connected to governance, particularly royal governance? You can see from the list of monarchs here, I'm not going to go through them separately, please have a think about the history of the period in your own time, that there are a lot of religious changes in the period and that they are often linked to the figures of individual monarchs. Henry VIII is the one who brings about the Reformation in the most meaningful sense of the word. Although Henry dies a Catholic, Henry remains a Catholic king. He has founded the Church of England, broken away from the Pope in Rome because he wants to divorce his queen, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn, his second queen, who of course he subsequently has executed. So whilst he remains a Catholic, he wants to be head of his own church so that he can grant himself a divorce. His son, Edward VI, is broadly Protestant. His mother, Queen Jane Seymour, is a Protestant woman. He's succeeded by a Protestant queen who lasts 9 days and is not officially recognised as ever having been Queen of England. He is then succeeded by his sister Mary, who is Catholic, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, wants to take the country back to her mother and father's period religiously. She marries Philip II, the King of Spain, which is of course a Catholic country. And this is a very Catholic period, an intensely Catholic period of the redesign of English Catholicism. But Mary does not live long as queen, and she's succeeded by her sister Elizabeth I, moving into the period that we're now familiar with and in which Hamlet is written, who is a Protestant, who is an Anglican queen, who regards herself as head of the Church of England. An astonishing concept. A woman is head of the church in England. My goodness me. We'll come on in part 3 of the lecture to why that's so revolutionary. And then she, when she dies in 1603, is succeeded, as perhaps Essex wanted, by James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of England, and he is broadly Protestant. This is all very confusing for people in the period. It is more or less impossible to tell if you're a perfectly ordinary villager, say in Essex, what the next monarch is going to want from you. There are an awful lot of things to argue about. One of those things is purgatory. I think if you want to put your finger on a place in Hamlet where you can see the raggedness of religious discourse in the period, where you can see the relationship between religion and politics and just how edgy and complicated this is and how people really aren't sure what to think about particular religious concepts, you could point to the moment where the ghost of Hamlet's father, if that is who he is and what it is, emerges from some kind of fiery place which may or may not be purgatory. Purgatory is one of the beliefs left over in Protestant times from the Catholic past. Religious changes marooned some of these ideas in modernity, leaving them without the proper doctrinal context. Purgatory is one of those. It remains as a sort of ghost itself in the play of Hamlet. Purgatory is a state after death, but it's between life and death. It's a moment when your sins are supposed to be expiated, purged, burned away. It's often thought, therefore, as having a hell-like fire burning away impurities, where people's souls are refined after death like a metal. And, you're made fit for heaven, and therefore you can go on and you can fulfill your destiny as a Christian and end up in paradise. It was thought that ghosts could return from purgatory, but the problem was that they were very tricksy things, ghosts, as all spiritual creatures were in this period. What if they were actually coming back from another place? What if they were actually coming back from hell, and they were in fact sinners who had not been able to expiate their sins? Or what if you'd done away with the concept of purgatory altogether, and thus the fiery place could only be hell? Because, hey, you didn't believe in purgatory anymore if you were a good Protestant. So these spirits could be seen as either good or evil, therefore. But Protestants, and of course Hamlet is written in a Protestant period for a Protestant queen and her subjects, Protestants increasingly see any state after death as deeply problematic. Ghosts are not really supposed to come back. Any form of spirit that you encounter is more likely to be a demon than anything else, is more likely to be evil. And demons, they thought, might possibly pose as ghosts. It might appear to be the ghost of your deceased parent coming back to visit you in a touching moment of communion with the past and the revelation of a terrible hidden crime, which is how Hamlet initially receives the visit of his father's ghost. But, and he speculates on this in the play himself, what if this is actually not his father? What if this is some kind of demonic illusion, some creature from the beyond? So purgatory is one of those moments, I think, when you can see the play engaging with contemporary religious complexities and debates. And Hamlet has this debate, as many contemporary Christians did with himself, about what he's supposed to believe, what he's supposed to think about the world and the universe and the way everything is shaped and God's purpose in things. And indeed, most personally and sadly, what he is supposed to think about the ghost of his father returning to him. The play is set in an early medieval period, but Shakespeare has to negotiate the contemporary complexities of his time when it comes to religiosity. And he's not alone in this, and this controversy about purgatory is not alone either. There are so many other things that early modern people are deeply confused about. What about limbo? Limbo is an analogous state to purgatory, where unbaptised babies and innocents were supposed to go after they had died. This was a Catholic concept. Was it supposed to continue into Protestantism or not? Broadly, no, but how were you supposed to know that if you were just an ordinary London playgoer? What about when you went to church during the communion service, or Mass as the Catholics have referred to it? Does the bread and wine transubstantiate? Does it become the actual flesh and blood of Christ the Saviour? Or is it just symbolic? Protestants think it's symbolic. Catholics believe it transubstantiates, it magically transforms. And if this is magic, is it a bad kind of magic? Is it the demonic kind that we were talking about earlier? Or is this good magic? Is this God's magic? What are you supposed to think? It could become incredibly important. Should services and prayers be said in Latin or English? So language is drawn into this controversy. Is a life of good deeds more important than perfect faith? So Protestants thought you could be saved sola fides, by faith alone. But Catholics were more inclined to think good deeds in life were meritorious, that being a good person was important. Of course, these are issues with which Hamlet debates when the figure of Hamlet, old Hamlet, returns from purgatory or wherever he has been, he's trying to think back to his life and has he been good enough? We think about Claudius's past life, we think about Gertrude, we think about ways in which we can tell somebody is a good person and what that will mean for them. Will they be saved after their death? Will God take them into heaven? Or will he not? Will he send them to hell? It's a terribly anxious thing to have to think about. As some people will know today who have a religious family or religious themselves. These are still incredibly important issues for many people. And they were backed up in the Reformation period by intense concerns about what would happen to you if you said the wrong thing. It was not just about what you believed personally, about the terrible question of what would happen to you after death, but more importantly, would somebody come round to your house and take you away to prison if you were said to believe the wrong thing? What is the role of religious imagery and decoration is another important question of this period. And of course it gets mixed up in the role of drama as well. We've talked about the ways that drama can be an approach to reality in which, for example, a contemporary monarch might see themselves in the portrayal of a monarch on stage, in which a play might have a real-world political context. Well, of course, it could also have a real-world religious context too. Any religious words that were spoken on stage, any religious rites that were portrayed on stage were extremely controversial. And beyond that, there's concern about the role of illusion and imagery and pretense, the artifice of one person pretending to be a character, another person, the artifice of a man dressing up as a woman, the artifice of decoration of a stage, of a church, of a theatre. Does this artifice, is it good for religious experience? Does it help us to appreciate the sublimity of God? Does it help us to access the divine? Or is it in fact a distraction? Is it even perhaps demonic? Should we sweep it away? Should we purify everything? That was what the Puritans wanted to do. And within that, does religious drama have a place? There were lots of medieval plays of saints' lives and incidents from the lives of Christ himself and various good people from church history. Should those be swept away? Protestants thought they should, and so they ended. And in that way, religion stopped being involved in drama, and drama passed into the secular world of the Elizabethan theatre. So these are all issues that are caught up together, and when people see a play in this period, this is a kind of subtext running in the back of their mind. What should I think religiously? What should I think politically? Gender is important here too. We started to talk a little bit about the surprise of having a woman as head of a national church. Because, of course, in the religion of the period, both Protestant and Catholic, there was intense concern about women's role. Women were not allowed to be priests, and they weren't allowed to be priests until the end of the 20th century in England, in Britain, as it subsequently became. Should priests marry? Protestants in the period began to say yes. Catholics continued, as they do today, to say no. Are women unclean in religion? Why, for example, are they more likely to become witches? A question which is close to my heart because I work on witchcraft and magic in this period. And indeed, up to 90% of the witches accused in England were women. Are there saints? Are there male and female figures within the church to whom good Christians can look up? Is there a sort of alternative pantheon of some kind? Should we reject them? Do women saints really have a place in a contemporary Protestant church? This is the kind of thing that people are asking themselves at the time. And of course, the Virgin Mary is at the heart of this. As the mother of Christ, what role does she have? She's clearly an exceptional female religious figure of some kind. But what is she? And is the cult of Mary, as Protestants often referred to it, is that simply a Catholic thing? Is it somehow wrong? Should you have images of the Virgin Mary in churches? If you look at the next slide, you can see some of those images being pulled down by iconoclasts in the period. We spent a lot of time in recent months thinking about the role of public images, of public imagery, of people, of concepts. And of course the Reformation is a period of smashing of those images. Protestants go into churches and start smashing religious figures, defacing religious paintings. And they do that because they have a concern that imagery may be wrong. And some of that concern is about gender, and we'll come on to that in the next section of the lecture. So a summary of this section and the ways in which religion and the contemporary debates about religion relate to Hamlet. We're dealing with a time of violent political instability and violent religious controversy. There are intense concerns about salvation and damnation and what happens after death. There's also an intense concern about representation, visual imagery, the correct use of words, the instructional purpose of drama, or whether in fact it is a bad thing. There are concerns about portraying preternatural events in characters, so supernatural if you like. Preternatural is a better way of thinking about them. Go and look up what the term means. Concerns about illusion itself, and we'll come on to this in the next section of the lecture, there are particular concerns about portraying women and sexual activity, especially where, like Gertrude in the play, these are also queens. These are women who have a lot of power. How much power should they have? Is women's power somehow ungodly or impious? Please look at the next slide for the exercise to end this section of the lecture and think about the ways in which the play is a religious artefact as well as a political one.